Hey guys, Chris Dick here. So this is part 14 of my user services series. And what I'm going to be talking about today is expanding models. Now, our models that we have right now are fairly reasonable models. There's nothing too complex about them. The key is that what we want to do now is bring them into a world of where they've got a little bit more stuff, if you will. So it being able to, add entities that relate to it, and specifically on the company side. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow the company employees model. And to do that, we need to create an employees class. Now, the employees class is fairly easy to do. So we have an employee just like this. Now, it's going to be relating to the company, to a company, so it'll need a foreign key of company ID. The other thing that it will also need is a relationship to users. So we'll have a user ID here as well. And because we have a foreign key to a company, we'll also have a navigation property for company. So let's add in that. So we'll have a company right there. And there we have it. And of course, these are virtual properties. All of our navigation properties in this case is virtual because we will be using our lazy loading. Okay, and this one is going to be a application user. And the name is going to be user. Again, trying to be consistent with the rest of the naming conventions throughout the application. All right, so now that we have this join table implies as well that we're going to need to have a one-to-many relationship as a user and a one-to-many relationship as a company. So if we go up to the user, what we have is up here. So at the application user side, we have a one-to-many relationship with companies. We will now have a one-to-many relationship with employee. Now, employees in this case is not going to be employees. It's actually going to be employed by, because these are companies that as an employee, I'm employed by now. So every company will also have employees. So with that, we'll move down into here, and I'm going to actually just copy this line here because it's pretty much the same. And that means as we go into here, we have employees. So we have employees just like that. And now this model is set up to have many employees, and I can work for also many companies. Okay. Next step, in order to make that function as a configuration, we would also need to have a configuration on company. And that configuration looks something like this. So we have has many, and it has many employees with one company. So we have to look up company. And then we have a foreign key, and we call that company ID. Okay, then we also want to set some on delete behavior. And the delete behavior, it is in this case, it'll just be setting the client to null. In the case of application users, it has a similar thing to do. We have our employed by, and we actually don't have to do too much, but if I delete the user, I do want to cascade that so that it just simply deletes the relationship between the company there as well. Now, when we look at what application configuration does, all it's doing here is creating a one-to-many relationship with the companies and employees. Going back to company, we have a relationship with employees, but now what we also want to have is a configuration class for employee. So going to create a class for that, and it will be called employee configuration. Entity type configuration, and it is a type of employee. And we'll implement the interface on that, which will give us this configure method. Now, what we'll do here is set up a key. So we do the hasKey function. And this is an object essentially. So in this case, what it is a company ID, comma, a user ID. So how this works now is that when we use a find function, for example, in our repository, we use that object array. If you've been following along, we used an object array to actually look this up. What it traditionally does is it looks at the ID, which is just a singular column, pretty easy to look up. But you can imagine when we have to look up two or more columns to identify an entity in a table. Some of those some lookups could be several columns involved in that, and of course that makes it a lot more difficult to find if we're trying to use this generic approach. So Microsoft has handled that by using this object array. And what it does is it simply says, okay, what's the order of operations here? It just simply says, okay, I look for a company ID first and user ID second. So if I supplied the user ID first and company ID second in my find, it wouldn't work. So long story short, we now have an entity that functions off a composite key. Now that we've set up these models, we have to go into our application DB context. Now, our application DB context will do a few things. It's going to do our configurations, and we have an employee configuration there. We also have to set up a table, and that table is simply an employees table. All right, so once we've got that into our DB context, we have to set up a migration to make this function. So let's go ahead and make that happen. So add migration, and I'm going to call this add employees. All right, so now that we have our migration, let's examine what it's doing here. We are creating a company called, or a table called employees. It has two columns, company ID and user ID. We have a primary key that uses a composite key of company ID and user ID, and then we have our foreign keys related, and then we also have an index related to user ID. So let's go ahead and push that to the database. Okay, so now that we've got that into our database, we can actually run the model here. We can run our application and see what happens just to test it out, make sure there's nothing broken now that we've added these new features. All right, we're in Swagger, so let's take a look at the schema. There's three objects that I want to look at, and that is application user, company, and employee. Now, when you think about how our application user is set up, one of the things that it had that we had to do was eliminate some of the features. So we said, I only want to see these features. We had ID, email, and companies. So we haven't added in the employees yet. So we're going to do that next. We also have a new feature on companies, which is a collection of employee. And you can sort of see that it's doing this funny cascading thing, and that's not terrible, but you can see you could easily kind of go down a very long path there that's unnecessary. That is because our employee doesn't do any schema modification at the moment. So we're going to go ahead and do some of that now. All right, so let's look at what we wanted to do here. We're going to add in the employees to the app, or employed by, to the application user. We look pretty good on company with the exception of employee, and we're going to remove company and we're going to remove the user, so that when someone is referring to the employee entity, they don't need to think about company and user at the same time. It gets a little more confusing. And it assumes when you add too many features into the model, it makes them think that they can make modifications, and we really don't want them to do that. So let's go back to our application and do some modifications now. So we'll go back into our identity models here, and we'll start off with our application user schema modifications and or schema modifier. And we're going to say that we want the employed by feature to be added. So that should be fairly easy. All we had to do is set our public properties. Next, in company, I don't think we had any changes to do there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to steal this API schema modifier and I'm going to add it in to the employee, and we're going to look at adding the iSwagger example modifier, because now that we're adding these modifiers, we want it to pick up in our schema modifier or schema filter for Swagger, and it'll make these changes that we need. Now, when we think about what we're going to do here, I want my company ID and user ID to show as not nullable. So we're going to be setting them to false, just like we did with company. And I can do that here. So let's just do some renaming magic. Okay, we have company ID. And once again, we change this one to company ID. So that it looks for company ID and not just ID. Next, we can change this one to user ID, and then employee.userid. So those two features are now taken care of. They will now appear as not nullable in our schema. The next thing that we want to do is actually remove some other features here. So we want to remove the company property, and that comes from employee.company. So we already have our user being removed, and that came directly from our company, but we do have to make some changes here so that it's coming from the right name. And I think we should be good. So what this does, sets the schema to show each of these properties as not nullable. It also removes company from the schema and user from the schema. And that was the agenda that we set up earlier, so that we would get rid of a few things that were unnecessary in the Swagger schema. So let's run this again and see what happens. All right, we're back into Swagger. We'll go back down to our schema and just explore some of these entities here. So now we have our application user. Application user also has the employed by, and that is an employee entity that is associated with them. It shows as nullable here because it's quite possible that a user is not associated with a company, so not employed by anyone. And same goes true with the employees collection here. We also have our employee objects related there. And then when we go into our employee, we now see that these are also not nullable. So this was a really short video. The reason I'm keeping this one short is because the next stages are going to be much more involved. There's at least 2 more videos I'm going to create. The next one is going to be integrating these new model features into views, and then we'll integrate them as well into our API so that we can have this full range of effect of things that we can do in our application. I hope you like this one. It was short, and usually I have much longer videos, but I think the rest of them are going to be really interesting for you. So stick around. I hope you'll watch the rest of them and watch the future ones. Thanks a lot, everyone. Love you. Bye.